Welcome, everyone, to this session of Meet the World with the National Centre for Writing, supported by the National Arts Council of Singapore. So I'm Yin, and I'm based in Norwich, which is the home of the National Centre for Writing. And today I'm sharing a conversation around writing the family, around family relationships, incoming of age stories, and anything related to family. I'm joined by two wonderful writers whose works evolve around family. Melanie Lee is the author of the award-winning middle grade graphic novel series, Amazing Ash and Superhero Ama, and picture book series, The Adventures of Squirky the Alien. She also wrote Out and About in Singapore, a travel guide series for children. She is a part-time communications and creative writing lecturer at the Singapore University of Social Sciences. Melanie is currently doing a virtual residency with the National Centre for Writing, and she's working on a YA novel. Iqbal Hussain was born and raised in Blackburn, Lancashire. He studied mathematics at Bengal University before pursuing journalism, contributing to many publications, including The Guardian and The Young Telegraph. His debut adult novel, Northern Boy, is a coming-of-age story inspired by his childhood, was published in 2024. His first children's novel, The Night I Borrowed Time, will be published by Puffin in January 2026. Iqbal has won numerous short story competitions, including the UK prize in this year's World of Interiors Mont Blanc Writing Competition. He now lives in North London near Epping Forest with his partner and friendly Labradoodle. Welcome, Melanie and Iqbal.
Hi, Yin.
I
Hi.
hope you're both keeping well. I'm just going to kick off the conversation. So we're talking about the family, but so as I introduced in the bio, you're both your work evolve a lot around the family, and I'd like to kick off the conversation by asking, why is family at the center of your work? Maybe Melanie, you'd like to start?
Yeah, I guess for me, writing is a way of processing my childhood and my memories. And of course, the family features a lot in that. And I think in general, the family as an institution, it plays such a key role in most people's lives when it comes to forming one's identity and building relationships. So, like especially my story that I'm working on the moment revolves around a lot coming of age. So I think ultimately the key characters would tend to be family members as well.
Right. And Iqbal?
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. And I'm the youngest of 6 children, so
Well,
yes, exactly. So we've always had lots of noise growing up and stuff. So family's been ever present. And when they say write about what you know, often obviously we all know about our families, and it's really easy to kind of plunder those kind of memories and experiences. So I've always found it really easy to kind of work with short stories um, that are based on my family's experiences. They're all slightly fictionalized, of course, as real life is often not as interesting as we think it is to other people. But it's always something I end up going back to time and time again. And no matter how much I write about various aspects of my family and my upbringing and my mum and dad and my siblings, you never get to the end of it. There's always something more that you explore and that you find. So for me, it's a rich seam of inspiration. And as Melanie said, it just helps you process things. It's such a good way of processing things that you've grown up with. Um, and it just always inspires, always makes me feel creative. And I love going back to it.
right. No, that's a really good way. I mean, when you talk about how it helps you process things in life. And Melanie, you've mentioned identity as a big part. I mean, identity is a big part of what we I mean, it's a big part of us. And um, both your books deal pretty much about their coming of age stories someday. So that identity is a huge part of that sort of narrative. And um, I guess my question would be, can you tell us a bit more about trying this journey of finding one's own individual identity and voice within the noise and expectations of family? Iqbal, you say that you come you come from a huge family. I'd like to know how that how you tap into that when you write about seeking your seeking identity in Northern Boy, because certainly with the character of Rafi, he's really trying to find his way. He's striving to be his own person in the family, as well as the community that um, has certain expectations and certain perceptions as well. So just to reiterate, did that come about? Was that quite natural to focus on that search?
Yeah. For me, I've always written about um, that kind of thing about the identity, who you are, where you fit in. And as the youngest of six, you really have a lot of time in which you can question where you fit in. And you see all the other siblings around you have their particular personalities and the way they speak and the way they behave. And then you, as a young person, as a youngest, have really got to find your own way, as you could very easily get lost in that big, noisy environment. So I've always written. I'm the only one of the six who writes. I'm the only one of the six who's doing something that's creative. And for me, it's just very important. Um, I've always loved reading books which are coming of age. I find that whole thing fascinating. It's such a key part of one's growing up experiences, where you're changing from being a boy to a young man, or you change from being a young man to an older man. I just find those transitions endlessly fascinating, and no two stories are the same of coming of age stories, as um, your own experiences of being a writer are completely different. We all have different family setups. We approach these things completely differently, and yet they all have their kernel, this thing about transformation, identity, as Melanie said, and just who you are and how you fit into not just your family, but into the wider community, into the wider world. And I just love investigating those kind of questions, and just writing little quiet things that are actually quite big. So for the life of that character, these are really big things, but in the general scheme of things, they're quite small. So yeah, I'm endlessly fascinated by people, by other people's stories, and I really hope that people find my stories as interesting and fascinating. But yeah, I've always enjoyed doing it.
Something quite universal about it, isn't there? This coming of age.
Absolutely.
This we all go through this, and you're right, Iqbal, in that sense that each person will have their own individual experience, but there's certain universal truths, as they say, that resonate with everyone. And what do you think, Violet?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was gonna say it's really like a fork in the road. Like you have well, I think there are actually many paths, but I guess if you want to simplify or distill it to its essence, it's a fork in the road, and there are actually two main kind of directions to go on. Whether you are choosing to go along with what your family has told you should be doing your life all along, or choosing to forge your own path. And I think it's a very critical moment, and I think I might maybe bring it down more specifically to the Asian experience, where I think a large portion of Asian families tend to be more prone to being overprotective when children are at this coming of age stage. And on top of that, veering away from what is expected is met with a particular kind of resistance, which I think takes several years to unravel, in my opinion. So, yeah.
Those are really good points, Melanie, because yet those expectations are so high in Asian families, whether South Asian or Southeast Asian. That
Mhm.
it's largely about what the neighborhood will think, and what your next door neighbors will say, what your grandparents will say. It's really hard as a young person growing up in that environment, especially if you feel different and you want to express yourself, and there's just all this expectation of, no, you must do this, you must do that. So writing about it, it really helped to come to terms with what you yourself went through, what your siblings have gone through, what your friends went through. And yeah, again, even though everyone's journey is slightly different, there's commonality at the base of it for sure.
Yeah, I think you both capture this quite well. You both, yes, this sense of writing about about finding your identity, find your own way. In particularly coming from societies that are quite collectivist, quite community based. As you've rightly said, these expectations, but particularly tensions around family love and duty, because you're brought up to think about not just yourself but about everyone else around you. And I think both your writing, both of you, your writing, you capture that really well. Iqbal, in your book, you've got Rafi trying to be trying to make his mark, be himself, but in this environment where there's this need to conform. In This is in 1980s Blackburn, in an immigrant Pakistani family, right? And Melanie, your work in progress right now, your YA novel, you're dealing with Magnolia, a teenager who is trying to um, uh, come to terms with being what you call slightly above average, and trying to deal with family relationships around that, in a society that expects so much as well. Again, in a very collective society. How do you both capture the tensions, of of your characters' expectations, how they deal with these expectations?
Ooh, that's a really good one. As we all know, every story works best if you have conflict. So tension as a writer is a really beautiful thing. It's not so beautiful when you're young and you're facing it, but as a writer, my goodness, it just gives you these amazing dramatic scenes and things. Um, so for me, I've always enjoyed writing those scenes. Um, I love it when somebody comes up against some kind of authority figure, and in my stories, it's usually the parent. But it could just as easily be some crabby old lady neighbor who has a say in the whole community, and every community has that kind of person. And I just think in those situations, it's really good for you to just show almost with the things that are not being said as well, and or how somebody responds to these things that are going on in the story, as to what the expectations are from that person or from that community, and then what it tells you about your character who's coming across those tensions. How are they dealing with it? Are they going along with it? And maybe at first they do go along with it, but then something changes in your story. Some incident happens, and beyond that point, your character suddenly realizes, you know what, I don't have to go along with this. I've done it all my life up till this point, but now something's changed and I've got to break free from it. So these are really lovely, interesting points as a writer to explore. And yeah, I always enjoy writing those scenes, and any book that has that kind of genesis of tension, it's such a joy for me to write. But also as a reader, I love reading those kind of stories.
Right. Yeah, same here. I think I like playing around with dialogue a lot. So arguments are definitely part of the, like coming to terms with, or like trying to negotiate the tension between individuality and collectivism. But I think for me, I also base it a lot on my own emotional tendencies, which is a lot of self-conflict and a lot of self-policing. And it's always building up. So always like to show that building up, like you said. I think Iqbal was talking about that turning point, right? So I like to describe like all like the leading events that will reach that turning point where the protagonist probably gets pretty explosive, or says or does something really out of the norm to actually kind of shake up the plot a little bit. Yeah.
So we're talking about these tensions they capture either through dialogue or through the character's journey to this moment, this so-called incident, as they say in fiction, right? Writing
Yeah.
fiction. Um, and you've got characters around you, family members. So we talk about writing family dynamics. In coming of age stories, sometimes it can be particularly challenging to write. I say challenging, but maybe both of you actually find that challenge. You relish in that challenge because it's about writing about these people around your main character, like if I say either parents or people in the neighborhood. I think you capture that in your series, Amazing Ash series. It's very easy to portray them as villains, particularly parents. But for a young person in your young character, parents are almost always the people you have tensions, you encounter these tensions with. How do you capture that relationship with more nuance in order to bring through the complexity of those relationships, and how that adds to that journey, the character's journey? Melanie?
So actually, okay, the interesting thing is like I have a much easier time writing from the point of view of an angsty teen. I think a lot of that comes down as my way of processing my own past. But the parent, there's a lot of hesitation because my son also just recently became a teenager, and a lot of things seem to have changed these past few months in terms of how I should be communicating with him. And I think it's been really a humbling experience for me as a person, but also with my writing and how I'm portraying, her parents, Magnolia's parents, at the moment with my young adult work in progress novel. And I think I now I understand that the parents are also just as clueless as the young protagonists. And at the end of the day, like baseline is they actually do want the best for their children, even though they may not really know what is the best at that time. So I think what I'm trying to do now is also try to show more multiple perspectives of parents revealing more vulnerable moments, where they are hesitating or they feel the child's hurt when they hurt their child, to sort of show that there's more to just like they are there as resistance, they are there to prevent the youth from evolving to who they're meant to be. Yeah. So that's where I'm coming from right now.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Melanie. And yeah, it's so tempting, isn't it? If you have a coming of age book and there's a young person and an older person, for you to make the older person definitely into some kind of black and white villain. So I had to be really careful not to do that, because Northern Boys, even though it has a young person at the heart of it, it's a book aimed at adults. So I had to make sure that it was nuanced. So in the end, I decided that even though it is Rafi's story, the young boy's story, it's also his mum's story. So I then needed to make her as rounded a character as he was, and made sure that she had all these things going on in her life that we learn about from him observing it and him recording it. And then you as the reader then get to read in between what he's telling you, as it's a first person account. So I love writing in first person. I feel very comfortable doing it. But the big downside, of course, is that you're seeing everything from that one person's point of view. So I had to make sure that quite often he would listen in on conversations that he was not meant to be listening in on conversations, or he would be reporting verbatim how his mum and dad were talking to each other, and you would get him trying to understand what they were saying, but usually he would get it wrong because he's age 10, so he's not really capable of much complex thought like that. But you as a reader can definitely work out in between what he's telling you, well, actually his mum's behaving like this because even though she's doing something, let's say, quite horrible to him, or he perceives it as quite horrible, you sense that actually she's coming at it from a point of view of love. So she's really trying to protect him from things, but the way she's administering that love comes across to him as quite authoritarian, which I guess is most young people, if you ask them, will always think their parents are wrong, they're tyrants, they're dictators, and they forget very easily, don't they, that their parents used to be young, that their parents had lives before they came along. So all of that kind of thing helps to just round out
Yeah.
the adult characters.
Yeah, Iqbal, I really like the little details you portrayed of the mom in Northern Boy, because like how she liked music. She was really passionate about music like her son, but she kind of suppressed that, to be grown up. I actually quite like that aspect of getting to know her towards the end of your book. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important, isn't it? Just to make sure that no one is outwardly all villain. No one's outwardly all saint. We all have these mixtures of things.
Yeah.
And parents and older people in the books that we write will always have these things that are formed their personalities. So a lot of what they say and do is usually born out of their own experiences, or it's born out of wanting their child to be happy or to be safe. And it's our role as writers, I guess, to make sure that we write about them in this lovely rounded way. So they can still be unlikable to an extent because of what they're doing, but you should be able to understand where they are coming from, even if you can't completely sympathize with it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I do like what you say, Iqbal, about that sense of leaving space for the reader to, so to speak, fill in the gaps. When I say filling gaps, meaning that you're actually leaving room for the reader to even bring in their own memories, their own experiences growing up, especially when you talk about adult reader, right? Being able to then relate to what Rafi's going through, but also perhaps being able to see the mother's, to empathize with the mother on that, in that sense, right? Oh, what did I want to ask? I think that sense of what's unsaid. So, I think Melanie, with your work too, especially with your graphic novel, it's capturing that in dialogue and in some of the situations where, you don't have to say a lot in order to portray that.
Yeah. Actually, I want to maybe bring up, just met a recent adult reader of my middle grade novel, and I was just quite intrigued. Like, the details he picked was very different from how kids give me feedback. And he said that he liked the little details where I um, show the mom, like, even while they're doing their superhero operations, the mom will still be getting takeaway food to make sure the kids are fed before they go and do their superhero stuff. And she's like, that's only like, that's so Asian, but that's like only something a mom writer would think about. Yeah. And I felt like, okay, I didn't consciously try to put that in. It was just me like, yeah, like they're going to do this in the evening, they need their dinner first, right? So I think that was quite interesting that the readers like these aspects, that you show like real mom moments within the story. I also show her like watching K-dramas when she's very stressed and she has facial mask on and stuff like that, to show that she does get burnt out and she needs her downtime. Yeah, I like to show these little things. And fortunately, graphic novels, the illustrator can have a lot of fun with those scenes because there's no speech bubbles required, but you have these panels that show her like flopping out, to some K-drama on her laptop in the bed. And yeah, and then that shows her more as a fuller person rather than just the bossy, like dictator of
Not
the children.
one-dimensional, in
Yeah,
other words, right? Which is quite easy to fall into that trap
exactly. Yeah.
as you go along. Writing mothers, because mothers are quite central in both your work. I think certainly in Northern Boy, I haven't read your really looking forward to your next your next book, Iqbal, and having read Melanie's work. Tell me a bit about that. Mothers is why why do you gravitate to the mother figure, and do you they're so sad. Why focus on the mother and your inspirations for your mother characters?
Yeah, I would say for me, in Northern Boy especially, I'm the youngest of 6 children, so I'm very much a mummy's boy. I'm very spoiled. I'm the king of her brood as far as she's concerned. I can do no wrong in her eyes, except when I do wrong, and then she tells me. But she she has played such a big part in my life, and she's led such an interesting life. But often with women from that background, of her age, coming from Pakistan many years ago, her voice is often silenced and you don't hear it. And it's doubly silenced because she doesn't speak much English. So in so many ways, her voice isn't heard. And I just thought, you know what? I really want to have a character that's based on my mum. And the mum in Northern Boy is very much like my mum. But in real life, my mum was even more flamboyant and even more eccentric. I had to tone her down. I thought, no one's going to believe this if she's this eccentric. So I actually had to make her a bit more sensible. But she's just so exotic. And the mother of that period of 1981, how I remember her as a 10-year-old child, really was like that. So she would never wear the same outfit twice. She was very colorful. She was very eccentric. She'd be singing and dancing at all hours of the day. And I thought she was such a fun character. And I thought if I found her fun as a child, I'm sure other people would also enjoy reading about her. And then I also thought, okay, given all of that, we also need to round her up. We need to make sure that she's not a caricature, that she is real. And yet, so my main thing was definitely to give women like my mum who didn't have a voice, I wanted to give them a voice. So it all has come
That's
from that.
lovely.
And having featured her in lots of short stories, thank you. Having featured her in lots of short stories as well, which are based on her life. There's just so much that you can mine, that stories that you can tell that she will never be able to tell, but I can tell on her behalf. Interestingly, were she ever to read Northern Boy or read any of the short stories, were her English to be that good, I don't think she would recognize
Oh,
herself. So it's interesting that the mum that I remember and that I put down on the page in various forms, she wouldn't recognize herself like that. And she doesn't look backwards. She's always looking forward. Whereas I'm very much a sentimentalist.
yes.
Sentiment.
Very sentimental.
Yeah, you know what I mean? So very sentimental. I look back. I love nostalgia. Mother never sees nostalgia. She just thinks of it as, oh, it was a cold house. We had no heating. There was damp in the house. But what's to look back on that for? So she will never look back on times in her life, in particular, any hard times. So she looks forward. I, as a writer, often look back because often so much information is contained in the past. But she's just I find it endlessly fascinating. I think just even now she'll say things if I go up and see her, which I do every 2 months. So she lives up north still, so I go up and see her, and she'll say things just as a throwaway comment. I think, my God, Mum, there's a whole story in that one sentence that you've thrown away. And she will look back on it askance and say, but that was just how it was. And I'll say, but that was the terrible thing that you just revealed about something. So she's still this font of amazing stories and information. And yeah, and I just feel it's my responsibility to make sure that some of those stories are retained and we pass them on, and that other people kind of read them
And
and
giving
enjoy
her
them.
that voice, I think that is
Yeah.
lovely, you know?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
thank you.
I think I'm a bit more cynical about this writing the mother character because I just feel in general the role of a mother in most cultures, um, the bulk of caregiving is really on them, despite the progress with feminism and all that kind of stuff right now. But and especially in Asian societies, I do feel like the moms, like Iqbal's mom, for example, had to lose some of her individuality and dreams along the way. So I always feel like with every mom character that I do I write about, there is this undercurrent of like grief of like what might have been, um and and the thing is like but they're also trying to raise children who are going to be independent and resourceful, everything that they are not. So I do find that tension very interesting with most mother characters that I kind of play around with when I try writing. And with my YA novel Magnolia's mother, she's someone who's extremely responsible, extremely efficient, but her default mode is just disappointment. She's disappointed by a lot of people around her. And I think that, like her high achieving ways and that disappointment, that kind of leaves her in this state where she's like neither happy or sad. She's just kind of like letting life pass her by. And she knows something has to happen, but she doesn't know what it is that she needs to do to kind of shake things up from this like status quo of how she's leading her life right now. So I don't know whether that's very cynical for a YA book, but I think that's actually how I'm approaching the mom character.
I actually think that no, that in itself is also giving voice to women. You would think in this day and age, with this sense that speaking as a woman, as a mother, myself and Melanie, you're a mother as well. This sense that women in this time are told we can have it all, but we don't really. And this aspect of caregiving and having to split yourself and um, you know, giving so much to others, and a lot of times neglecting yourself and even finding yourself subsumed, like how you're saying, but your mother as well in that sense. It's also giving voice to these women who perhaps would never have that much of an outlet to express the frustration or, what they're going through as well, because there was a bit in Amazing Ash. I was going through one of the books. There's a scene where Ash's mother just pretty much explodes before she goes in to watch her K-drama. Things like that. I think it's about the fact that
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
tough. It is hard, But I do love this sense of giving voice in your writing. This is what I focus a lot on as well, about particularly with women who are in such collectivist societies that you're expected to just take this in, get on with it. It's like in I'm writing about my grandmother, and she took care of the family and such, but so much about her life, like your mom, Iqbal, that you, if you don't ask, you don't know these family stories. If they don't tell you these things, or it comes out as same. I learned these things through my own mother.
You're so right, Ian, honestly. And quite often, these women, particularly, I think, from Asian backgrounds, so I'd be curious in seeing how mums from a more English background, what their stories are, if they have the similar kind of, that sense of disappointment, as you say, Melanie, of a character whose main default is disappointment, or of dreams that just never happened for various reasons, because culturally it just wasn't acceptable to follow those dreams. I often think, gosh, if my mum had had an opportunity of, I don't know, becoming an artist, she loved colourful things, or be a musician or a singer, how her life might have been completely different. But it was never going to happen for her. And whereas I feel for an English mum, especially nowadays, things are much more on an even keel. You can generally do what you want. It is more possible to have it all. It's not always easy, of course it's not, but there are more possibilities. Culturally, there are fewer barriers that will stop you doing that. And I do think of mothers being a bit like an iceberg. So you see this tiny bit, that the mum thing, the very strong, they're always there. Whenever you come home from school, there was always food on the table. They would always hug you and kiss you, and all these things that a lot of mums are like. But underneath it all, it's all that unsaid stuff that you never know about when you're a child. All the things that made them who they were, and that made them these strong matriarchs. That is the bit that I find fascinating. It's not the bit that I see, it's the bit that I can't see. That occasionally they fling out a little remark or a little comment or a little story, and you think, my God, there's so much there that you haven't told anyone. Because, again, they come from cultures where you don't talk about things like that, where it's all hidden, it's stored away. Strength is not seen by sharing difficulties. It's about holding on to them and just working around them. And I just think honestly, hats off to them. I think the things that they've had to endure and to experience, and bring up a family, and have a husband, and live in a foreign country, and learn a language that's not their first language, and leave behind family, all these things, and somehow still maintain their sense of themselves, which ultimately I think is the bit that gets lost in their whole journey. I think they are pleasing so many other people in the end that they lose themselves. And that's part of what we do with these lovely stories about, we show them behaving in ways that are real, and we're not telling it, but we're showing it. So all those lovely details that Melanie talked about, that you just observe them doing something, and you think, oh my God, isn't that telling? But she's clearly just had enough. She's got to watch a film now. She's blocking everything else out. She's making a little bit of time for herself, which she generally wouldn't be doing. I just find it, I'm in awe of these women. I just think they're amazing, amazing women. And my goodness, if we can just shine a little light on some of that brilliance in the characters that we write, the grandmothers as well, again, even harder in many ways. So my children's book, we have a very strong grandmother figure as well, because I didn't know my grandmother, who lived in Pakistan. I maybe spoke to her on the telephone a couple of times, and that was it. But she was a stranger, really. But I so wanted my young character in my children's book to have this very strong, much older female character. And they are polar opposites. They don't understand each other at the beginning of the book. By the end of the book, they completely understand each other. He sees her as a fully rounded individual. and he has so much respect and love for her, and the love for her is earned. It's not like he's been told, it's your gran, you must love her. No, he's they both go on these incredible journeys in the book, and yeah, it's only right that we celebrate these incredible women.
Yeah, Melanie, I think you do that very well too with some amazing Ash and superhero armor.
Yeah, but actually, I like Iqbal. I had really limited contact with my grandmother, my paternal grandmother. My maternal grandmother already passed away before I was born. So I had some years of where I did spend time with her, but it was always very like perfunctory, like, oh, we have to be very respectful. You have to speak in Chinese with her. Like it was just very like I must do this. I didn't actually have that bond that I wrote with Amazing Ash and Superhero Armor. I guess that was my idealized version of a grandparent and grandchild relationship. But I do feel like this intergenerational thing is also a very powerful thing to have in children's books because, as children, what I remember as being a kid is that you're very centered around people around your own age only. And maybe slightly older, but they still should be youngish, right? Anyone around the age of your parents is already too old. But I do feel like them reaching out and connecting genuinely with someone who is elderly. I don't know. I think there's some reality shows that also have this kind of setup, and it's actually quite meaningful because um, they tend to be softer to each other. There's yeah.
Intergenerational relationships are so fascinating as well because it's looking back at who we come from, where we come from in that sense, and that distance as well, particularly with in Asian families, I find that expectation of respect, right? So with that respect comes a certain distance as well. So it's lovely that then you write these stories about how you get to know your grandparents that that you never maybe think so much about. And I want to bring something in here, as you're both talking about mothers, parents, grandparents. I recently attended a conversation event with an author, Sabrine Hasbun, whose book Crossing is a family memoir about her parents' love. So her Palestine, the love between her Palestinian father and her Italian mother. And she talked also about how, because she was asked a question about how, what would you tell readers? What would your advice be, or what would you say to them? And she said, when you have the time, get to know when you have the opportunity to do so. When we write, or you talk to your elders, get to know their stories, get to know them as people, not just as your parents, as your grandparents, because she said once that was one of the richest things she got from her writing her book, getting to know her father, Um, and I think that's part of what you both look at as well when you
Oh, yeah, it's a really good point because you're right. In our cultures, particularly, we are we are told that grandparents are almost on this like godlike level, so you have to respect them. That's the relationship you would generally have with them, rather than the more loving type of relationship that you see in films and things. So for me, it's really important that in my children's book that we circumvented that we challenged that, and that we actually make him really see his gran for who she is, but who she was, and he goes back in time at various points in the book. And at one point, he goes and he meets his gran as a young girl of his age. I thought that we had to see that for him to recognize that she wasn't always old and wrinkly and crabby. But a little girl used to run around on the streets of Pakistan at one point. And you're right. While we have the opportunity to talk to our parents and to talk to grandparents, if we're lucky enough that they are still alive, that's when you have to find out they're real people, who they really are. And it's been a real joy as a writer, and Melanie has the same experience, that we can give our stories these lovely elements that might not have been there when we were growing up, but we can fill in all those gaps. We can fill in the blanks. We can show a loving relationship between a young boy and his gran. And it's so interesting that the intergenerational thing, which isn't something that I'd thought about before, which is curious given that in the South Asian community particularly, that intergenerational family setup is very common. So often you will have in the one house for the children, the parent, and various grandparents and possibly some aunts and uncles as well. But when the book went out on submission, we had so much interest in it. And I think it was almost entirely because of that intergenerational storyline, which seems to have hit some kind of chord. And I thought it was a time travel thing that would be the element that would be really fascinating to people. They liked it, of course. It was interesting to them. But even if I hadn't had the time travel, I think just the intergenerational thing, that really drew people in. And everyone commented on it. So it's interesting. I think there's a real yearning for everyone to just connect with all these generation things. And maybe we don't see enough of it in books. Maybe we don't read enough of it, particularly in children's books. So it's been such an eye-opening experience.
Do you find that as well, Melanie, when
Yeah, I think that's why I decided that I wanted at least with my middle grade novel, I did want a grandmother as in the forefront of the superhero team, not like she's a behind the scenes wise sage figure that typically what you see in Marvel or DC type books or movies. That she would be in the forefront and she's the one actually kind of leading the way for these kids to figure out how they can help their community with their resources and the powers. So I did want to do that, and also because I was also I really like this Hong Kong movie called Kung Fu Hustle, where there was this landlady character who had all these fantastic fight scenes, and I remember just loving that like her scenes only. I don't remember much of the rest of the actors, but her scenes always like made me like crack up and also felt very empowering. And I just want to bring that action into a children's story, actually. Yeah. So
what was the response like to your series? I know you do a lot of work with schools as well, don't you? And do the children relate very well with the grandmother figure?
yeah, so I think what is interesting is that I do a mixture of schools, and I noticed that in general, the girls like to see the emo moments where Ash is freaking out and flipping out about things. I mean, because they are dealing with a lot of like circumstances, like the grandma has dementia, then they're doing all these superhero things which are really kind of risky and high stakes if you think about it, because they're just a bunch of middle grade children. Um, but the boys like the action, so and they like the kind of like punny humor. Like I try to put in some like lame jokes, and I don't find it that funny, but like the boys always find it really hilarious, and they like the fact that it's quite like there's both a relatively equal number of boys and girls in their team. So I feel like with children, they like the adventure and the humor, and like how everyone, even though there are differences, they're like a team. I think they just have fun with that. But with the adults, I do feel like there's more sentimentality with it. So parents buy this when they know that the children have grandparents with dementia, so they use these books as a way to start discussions. So I thought that was quite interesting. So yeah, but I do feel like it's a mixed bag. And I do find it's quite interesting. The girls like the emo moments, and I think one girl said like, "That mom is exactly like my mom. I'm buying this for my mom." I'm buying the mom because I like to see the mom flip out as well. Yeah, so yeah.
Yeah. But speaking of humor, I think you both employ humor so well to get across some difficult subjects. I mean, Melanie with dementia, Iqbal, the social commentary also over, you intersperse a lot. I mean, this is 1980s Britain, northern town, and then you've got the National Front, things like that. What are your considerations when you bring that, when you do that?
For me, it's always been so I love watching films like Billy Elliot, Bradstoff, Kinky Boot, all these very British films that have this amazing mixture of humor, but also quite serious storylines underneath it all, real pathos. So that's always appealed to me. And I think as a writer, it really satisfying for me to have things that are just funny, things that are just out and out funny, that make me laugh, and I'm writing them as well. They are the funniest thing, funny characters. I love writing funny characters. But equally, sometimes you've got some really tough topics that you have to deal with. Um, and I think if I were to write a book that was only ever full of very serious topics, I'm not sure I could do it, because even in normal life, I love comedies, I love rom-coms. I like laughing. I'm quite an optimistic person. But I'm also quite a realistic person as well. So that yin and yang is really important. And it's always there in my work, in my books, and in my children's book. I'm having a really fun time making it funny, but also there's this pathos. And as Melanie says, I love doing puns and little jokes and things. And I think of what a reader might think when they're reading this. And you're quite right. Boys definitely read differently, I'm pretty sure, than girls read. And they get different things from it. And sometimes they meet in the middle. But generally, I'm pretty sure it's the boys that love the fart jokes and the people being sick and all this kind of stuff. And the girls like a bit more detail. And it's so interesting. But the emo detail was just amazing. I love that. That's amusing in itself, that they love that. But yeah, that mixture of light and shade is really important for me. And I don't think I could do it any other way. I don't think I could write a very serious topic and not in some way then leaven that seriousness with humor. It just comes very natural to me. And also I think sometimes a reader needs a break. It's like, wow, they've had a really difficult scene, let's say on the National Front, walking in their neighborhood, or some awful scene with their mum where she's having a go at them. And then I do think sometimes you just need the next scene to be a little bit foot off the pedal. You can just relax a little bit. And even in the humor, sometimes you can relay some difficult topics because of the interaction that you have with two characters. And dialogue, as Melanie says, is such a good way of bringing that kind of stuff across, because you literally give voices to your characters and they speak slightly differently. Misunderstandings are often very illuminating because what somebody says and how somebody else reacts to it. They're just really interesting things as a writer. But yeah, I've always done it, that mixture. And Melanie, you do it in the same way. There's always a mixture of humor and more serious stuff. And it really works for me.
Yeah, so I think I'm not an optimist like Iqbal. I'm actually more of a pessimist, and that's why I have to put humor in, because I don't want to get too like hopeless. And I do think being able to laugh during hard times is actually a display of some kind of strength. It's hopeful behavior, and yeah, I think I agree with Iqbal that it gives some relief here and there, especially if you are bringing in very realistic and tough situations in the story. It gives some balance and like breathing space almost for the reader. And also at the same time, I guess if the book is about, dealing with greater issues like racism and or, whatever's happening in the world now, I actually do think that, like if aliens were looking at how humans are behaving, they would find that like some of the forms of the like some of the biggest forms of social inequalities actually make no sense. They're actually ridiculous, and there's actually so much to kind of poke fun at because there's so many loopholes in the kind of arguments that go around. So in my opinion, that's like if you want to do social commentary, you don't have to do it in a preachy way. You just have to find the holes and have fun with it. Yeah. So
Always.
You always,
okay.
you can never have too much ABBA.
Oh yeah, yeah. My parents really love ABBA, so I also grew up with that soundtrack. It's my childhood. Yeah. So
Honestly, I had such fun again choosing which ABBA songs I would use in the book, when to use them. And at one very, very early stage, I think every chapter was going to have an ABBA title song. And in the end, I thought even me as an ABBA fan, that's too much. So now the 3 acts are called after ABBA songs, and that's enough.
I have to say, both your work, I mean, just reading your works, I go from moments where I'm tearing up and then the next moment I'm laughing, that it is a really fine balance as well. So, I think that's such an achievement. So I want to talk a bit more now about representation, because this is something I think uh, uh, you both have touched on about how as writers, as how you came into it. The reason you come into you start writing. One of the reasons you write is because you want to write the books that you always wanted to see. Melanie, for you, it was sing lit, in a society. Similarly, I come from a similar background, Malaysia, where you grow up with a lot of Enid Blyton and American British books, because we read it, for those of us who read in English, particularly, because of our history. And Iqbal, you wanted to write about the South Asian experience in northern towns. When did you first realize that you could write your own stories about your cultures, your families, your experiences, and what works inspired you when to do that?
Oh, that's a good one, because do you know what? It's really weird. I was just thinking when I was a child of the kind of stories I used to write as a young boy, and I'm pretty sure there were always people with characters called John and Janice and Ellen, and
Janet,
honestly,
the Janet, yes.
wasn't it? It was always this, and that at the time seemed to be quite normal. But I think it was normal because I'd never read any books that didn't have characters called John and Janet and Peter. There were certainly no characters called Zubair and Rafi and Iqbal and Yin and Met. No, not at all. So I think back then you write what you see, what you read. So back then, yeah, very few Asian writers of any background were writing. And then once I started writing more seriously, I just remember thinking, gosh, I come from a very interesting background, this northern background, these mills that used to employ all these people, particularly people who came over to work in the mills. I mean, that's interesting in itself. So having spent most of my young adult life running away in every sense from Blackburn and going away as far as I could to university and then to London, once I turned like mid-30s, 40s, suddenly I began to think, you know what, that's quite an interesting background that I've come from. And I'm still not seeing stories set in the North written by a Pakistani person. I'm still not reading the working class experience that we grew up with. I'm still not reading about large families. And that's when I thought, you know what, if I don't write it, and no one else is going to write it. And also, if I don't write it, people will never know what it was like. And if I don't set down some of these stories, those neighborhoods that feature in some of my books, they've been bulldozed, that they no longer exist. Again, if I don't write about them, they will not be remembered by anyone else. So then there was a big sense of responsibility that came with it. I thought, oh my goodness, okay, I'm the keeper of the flame. Let me do it. But then I realized that, you know what, I can only write about my experience, that this is not everyone's experience if they come from a Pakistani northern working class background. There'll be similarities, of course there will be, but ultimately you can only write about your experience. And especially if you're doing it in that very autobiographical, fictionalized way that I was doing it. And once I realized that, it freed me up, because I thought, okay, this is good. I'm not bearing the weight of the whole community now. I'm not pretending that this is everyone's experience. This is my experience. And if somebody recognizes themselves in that, then that's amazing. That's wonderful. There's commonalities, of course, in all those things, in all those intersections. But ultimately, these are things that I'm writing about. But some other Pakistani northern writer might be writing about a different thing. And if just by me having work out there, that gives other people from my kind of background the confidence of thinking, do you know what? I've got some stories I can tell. Let me try and put pen to paper. Then it's all worth it. So yeah, ultimately, say I started off writing stories with Janet, John, and Peter. Then started writing about stories that really encompass my community, and now kind of writing about things that, do you know what, that I want to write about, that's still featuring aspects of my culture and my background, but I don't have that horrible weight of expectation that I set for myself, thinking that I've got to represent everybody. You can't.
Yeah, I think it's a bit different for me. I don't think it's such a big picture way, but in general, as a child, as a teen, I connected to a lot of American fiction books. So I think in middle grade, I really like this Ramona Quimby series by Beverly Clearly. I'm not sure, Yin, did you read that when you were young? Yeah.
I do.
And then in my teens, I really loved Judy Blume, all her books. I think I read all her books, but I really like Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, all coming of age stories. So very American. I think I got quite a lot of American influence in what I read, but I was reading quite widely, mostly Western literature. It was really only my late 30s I started heavily reading YA books, because I was borrowing a lot of like books from the library for my son, right, when he was growing up. And along the way, I just thought, okay, I also would try to read more books, but I didn't want books that were too complex. So I just kept going to the young adult section and just borrowing a bunch to read each time. And I found a lot of Asian literature along the way while going through all the YA collection in the public libraries in Singapore. And I think some stories really struck me. One is The Weight of Our Sky by Hannah Alcoff. It's kind of like a Malaysian, she's a really I really like her. She's one of my favorite Malaysian authors, but she wrote like about the racial riots, but from a teen's point of view. And I really, really, I was like kind of blown away by that account because she brings in mental illness and things like that that are like not often discussed, I think, in our even in Singapore and Malaysian literature. But she kind of wove all these very personal stuff within some like larger historical context, which I was really blown away. But I also really enjoyed YA fantasy, like Ghost Bride by Yang Zichu. I think she's Malaysian but living somewhere else, right? Like in the States. And or London or States, not sure. But and there's also Siran J. Chang, who wrote Iron Widow, which is kind of like a historical fantasy inspired by the history of Empress Dowager. And I love it because it's got robots, but it's also got like like period Chinese period drama romance, which I'm also addicted to C drama, by the way. So that was also up my alley. So yeah, I was just really like blown away, oh, that you can mix and match all these cultural influences and come up with really original ways of telling stories, whether it is contemporary or like, based on real life stuff or pure fantasy, like realms, but influenced by history. And I was just very inspired to want to have a go at trying to tell my own stories. And I guess that's why I'm doing a residency like this, to just explore that for now.
The genesis
Yeah.
of your writing, So I know we're going to wrap up soon. But before we go, I think there is one question that I want to come back to that inevitably comes up in conversations when we talk about writing the family, and that is about navigating ethical considerations. I mean, both of you work with fiction, so I would say, because I write mainly creative nonfiction, and I'm working on a family memoir now about my grandmother, so my own intergenerational story. But so with nonfiction, there's certainly a lot of considerations because you're dealing with real. You can't hide behind characters as such. But I'd like to know your take on that, writing fiction. But as you say, Iqbal, yours is, you take quite autobiographical approach. You're tapping into your own experiences, your mother. How do you navigate those considerations?
Yes, gosh. So when I first wrote Northern Boy, and right up until almost the penultimate draft, I used lots of real names in there. So lots of characters have their real name. And then right at the end, I thought, okay, quick word, find and replace, just call them different names, which is then really confusing reading my next draft. So I thought, who is this person? I don't remember this person. So there's good things about using a lot of autobiographical detail. The good thing is it's very easy to write because you have lots of stories and characters at your disposal. The bad thing is you can end up relying on them a little bit too much, and then also you think of them in their real name. So in the end, what I had to do also was I had to just change all the characters slightly. So let's say in Northern Boy he has 3 siblings. I have 6 siblings. I'm one of 6. So you combine characters and you combine characteristics. So in the end, the character, let's say who's called Sarish or whatever it is, she's not the real Sarish. She's an amalgam of 3 people now. So that instantly stops it being too real. The character of the mother, of course, I had to completely dial her down because the real one was just way too eccentric. So again, she's different. And then, do you know what? As each draft of the book happened, more and more plots got invented, and more situations got invented, more and more tensions got invented. So again, as the book goes on and the young character then ages, and we follow him through the ages of 30 and 50, it becomes less and less autobiographical. So it starts off rooted quite heavily in my childhood, but even that bit has been embellished and been changed around and swapped around, and stories have been just made more interesting. Humor's been added, much more tension and conflict than in real life. and then I consciously made it less than that realistic, just so that I wasn't really writing an entirely autobiographical book. It just happened to be fictionalized. But the very first drafts of the book were like that. And you know what? As comfortable as that was writing, it didn't sit right because it didn't read like a fiction book. It still read like a non-fiction book. And also, I didn't then want to have that situation where people really did recognize themselves in there, or are talking about stories that I thought somebody in the family might not want me talking about. So yeah, in the end, I just self-censored a little bit and then just made it much. You know, that also made it more interesting for me to write because I could then free myself up. I wasn't constrained by what really happened. So in the end, yeah, I became my own editor and thought, no, enough's enough. Just step out of your comfort zone and just start embellishing.
Yeah. I'll have a very brief answer to that. And I think it's impossible not to use real life experience. So definitely my personal experiences, the life of my friends and family, they're all kind of, I'm taking reference from all these things. But there's also a part of me that is like wondering if people might get offended, if they might see themselves in some of the stuff. But I feel like I'm still on first draft mode. So I'm just trying to get whatever I can out. But I'm very aware of the fact that I will be mixing and matching a lot. I think that's generally my approach to fictionalizing stuff that I might be using in real life. Yeah.
And I think that is a process that, as Iqbal has described, it's an ongoing process, isn't it? It's something that you find your way through. But certainly, well, at least you can change. Well, you can change names with nonfiction, but there is inevitably that question of also, is this your life story or is this person, someone in your life and such? But no. But I'm just going to tie up things. I think we've had hour of really really fascinating, interesting, but also quite moving conversation. And I really want to thank both of you for your generosity in sharing your thoughts about what writing the family means to you and how your process of doing it. And yeah, hope those tuning in will get a lot out of this. So I just want to thank you both for joining me today for this conversation. Yeah, it's been really great.
Thank you,
You're
Yin. Thank you,
welcome. Yeah, it's been a
Iqbal.
pleasure.
Yeah, it's lovely to do this. So, and just to also a huge thank you to the National Centre for Writing, as well as the National Arts Council of Singapore for making this possible, and thank you those behind the scenes, Martin, Lucy, Kate, who helped put this together. So, thank you.